One of the things I want to address is the whole issue of mind control techniques and how this applies to what cults do to control and manipulate their members. And one of the best things that I've found is the information provided in Robert J. Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, that was published, the research was done in the 50s, and it was originally done with a focus on prisoners of war and the Chinese re-education programs. And what they did is they went in and they interviewed people who had gone through the re-education programs and took a look at what techniques were used to change people from behaving in one way or thinking in a certain belief system into adopting what the present propaganda was, and in effect controlling what they thought. And out of the research, what he was able to pull out were there were 8 major techniques or criteria that were used to control people's minds and get them to change. And it's really interesting to see how these 8 criteria can be used to take a look at how cults control and manipulate their own members. The 8 criteria initially are milieu control, mystical manipulation, a demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, doctrine over the person, and dispensing of existence. And what I'll do is I'll go through each one so that you get a better idea of what it is as Lifton defined it, and I'll see what I can do about applying it to how cults use it, and specifically how the cult I was in, the Jehovah's Witnesses, use it. The last criteria is dispensing of existence. And in cults, it's like basically what they say is if you are within the group, you are saved. If you are outside of the group, you are not. And they define who is inside and outside of the group. Therefore, if you commit something or break one of their rules, you risk being expelled from the group, and therefore you are no longer saved. And as long as you obey all of the rules, then you can remain within the group. This instills, again, a lot of fear about breaking rules. So your membership is no longer about love of God or a love of doing what is right. It becomes about fear of breaking rules. And then a lot of guilt if you do something, because there are so many rules. It's like nobody could possibly obey them all. And that this fear and manipulation that is used, again, is an added control on people, so that you're controlling what you think, what you do, the knowledge that you have, the information. And when a lot of groups will use 1 or 2 of these on occasion, of the 8 criteria. Unfortunately, groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses use all 8, and they use them all the time. So that people do not have free will. And one of the things that I was looking at was this whole issue of consent, because people say, well, people choose to be in a particular group. People choose to become Jehovah's Witnesses. But there are 2 things that are required to consent to anything. One of them is that you have to know what it is that you are consenting to. And the second thing that you have to know, you have to have the freedom to say yes and no. And without that freedom to say yes and no, then consent cannot be given. 2 of the things that are required for consent and to explain why people join, or whether a person has consentingly joined a group. The first is that a person must have full information of what is involved in the cult. And the second is that they have to have the real freedom to say yes and no. And the reality is most cults do not fully disclose all of the rules to prospective members. Very often it's on a kind of need-to-know basis. So they wouldn't say to somebody, well, if you join the Jehovah's Witnesses, you'll never be able to celebrate holidays again. And if a family member leaves the group, you will never be able to talk to them again. Given just those two examples, most people would say, forget it. The fact that there isn't that full disclosure, a lot of people are basically manipulated into thinking they're joining something different than what they actually get. And the other thing is, with all of the guilt and the rules and the idea that all of this information comes from God, then the person is not really free to say yes or no, because they're led to believe that what they're saying yes or no to is not an ideology or a belief system, but rather God himself. So, penalty for saying no to God to somebody who believes in God and wants to do what's right becomes irrelevant. They no longer have feel that they have a choice to say yes or no to this. So very often what you have is a lot of people who are involved in a movement who believe that this is not a cult and do not see how they've been manipulated. And that's part of how the mind control techniques work, because they're so slow and subtle that a person doesn't realize how they're being taken over. There are a lot of effects of this kind of control. And very often people who have come out of cults begin to recognize the effects. But you can also see it in active members of a group. And there are several stages that people go through and in recovery. But even while people are in a cult, they lose, first of all, I mentioned earlier, their identity. They lose their individuality. But they also lose their ability to think. And this has been taken a look at by a few different people. And what happens is if a group is constantly feeding you the same information over and over again, after a while it becomes it's boring. So people wind up sitting there and tuning out. And the more you tune out, the easier it is for all mind control techniques to kind of implant themselves in you. And it becomes more and more difficult for the individual to challenge those thoughts. So, like the information about my uncle who was disfellowshipped and we could talk to and then we couldn't, and you don't say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You just accept that that's the way of things and that the information just changes and grows in new light and all of this. And there's no saying, well, wait a minute, how come it was this way and that way? This isn't a progression anymore. We're going backwards. And even thinking about that is condemned, to think that, wait a minute, this is not the way it's supposed to be. But people are so programmed not to think that these kinds of thoughts rarely enter their mind. And if they are, they're kind of pushed down. So thinking becomes difficult. Being able to reason things out becomes difficult, and this transfers to their general lives. So very often people drop out of school, but as they're becoming witnesses, they'll leave school. It's too much of a challenge because their mind is slowly shutting down. A lot of people become depressed, and there have been some things that I've read where depressed people become witnesses. Or people from difficult lives become witnesses. But there's also some information coming out about people, once they have joined, they become more depressed. And part of this is the loss of individuality, the loss of dreams for what they had planned career-wise. As a child, I wanted to be a therapist. And as a witness, that would have been totally inappropriate. And just continuing to, when I was in a witness, it was not encouraged to go on to past high school. So my career dreams were washed aside. And again, that dispensing of the person and person over the doctrine, that their needs come first.